So if people are ready, we're gonna begin. So this final session is on engaging new activists, and our three in-person speakers are all doing different campaigns that engage with young people, so have a real insight into a wide variety of issues, but how they can relate to peace and how they can relate to each other as well. So at the end, we've got Nobu, who is, if you heard at the beginning, spoke, but is a leader member of SOAS CND. Then we've got Kanako, who is an activist against US military bases in East Asia, but is also studying at SOAS. And Benali, who is chair of the Young Greens LGBTQIA+ caucus and equality spokesman for the Green Party, and is also running in the London Assembly elections. So, but to begin, we're going to start by a video from Emily Rubino, who is a peace activist in America, which includes helping over 21 student chapters across the New York State, so has a different angle to things. So we'll begin by seeing that video.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily Rubino. I'm the Director of Policy and Outreach at Peace Action New York State. At Peace Action New York State, we currently have 24 campus chapters who are working on a variety of peace and justice issues. And I think that in a time with so much chaos surrounding us, whether that be the climate crisis, the rise of right-wing authoritarian regimes, or the ongoing and impending wars that the US and its allies are engaged in, it's more important than ever to make sure that as young people, we're doing everything we can to speak out against this. The best way that I've found to engage our chapters and other young people in this is by illustrating the clear connections between all of our struggles. The US military is considered the world's #1 polluter. There's an inextricable link between militarism and the climate crisis, the same way that there's an inextricable link between the climate crisis and racism, between militarism and racism, and the list goes on. And I think that because all of these issues are so deeply entwined, it's important to make clear that by being any sort of activist, by working on any one of these issues, you're really working towards the more sustainable and equitable future that we're all envisioning. So our issues do not exist in silos, and we should be making sure that in our approaches, regardless of what we're working on, that we're being intentional about centering the voices of those most affected by our issues. So, for example, when we're focusing on issues of peace and disarmament, our work really needs to be informed by and led by those most affected, which is namely Hibakusha, those who have been directly affected by nuclear bombs and nuclear testing, as well as victims of war and conflict, the most severely impacted being women, girls, and those in the LGBTQIA community. A term that I've learned recently, nuclear colonialism, also comes into play here. We didn't just test nuclear weapons on anyone indiscriminately. We mined uranium, exposed people to radiation, and tested nuclear weapons on indigenous peoples in the United States and in the Marshall Islands, people who are really bearing the brunt of US empire. And this concept extends out to other nuclear powers as well, who tested and developed weapons at the expense of indigenous communities as a product of their colonial occupation. So I think that it can certainly be overwhelming at times to stay focused on one topic or one goal, especially right now when it feels like every day there's a new piece of devastating news. But I think that the best thing that I can communicate, and something I need to continue to remind myself of, as well as the students that we work with, and also hopefully all of you listening to this, is that whatever it is, whatever motivates you to take action, you need to take it and go with it. And by deciding to take action on whatever compels you most, you're really helping where we need you in this fight. So, yeah. I personally have been involved in organizing work since I was in college, where I was involved in different social justice and racial justice coalitions. So by the time I was ready to graduate, I had also broadened my scope into looking at militarism more broadly, and including the impacts of US militarism in our foreign policy, which isn't really much of a leap when you talk about when you're going from racial justice to US foreign policy, because like literally the police in the United States use military grade weapons provided by the Pentagon. So once I realized that I could also be making an impact, not just domestically, but also more broadly, and I could be speaking out against the huge chunk of my tax dollar that's being put towards this war machine, that's kind of when I got more deeply involved in peace and disarmament activism. And, you know, there's a lot that I've learned being in these circles and dealing with this. I think there's definitely some uphill battles that we need to face. For one, I think that we really need to work on diversifying the peace movement in the US. And from what I've observed abroad, the face of the peace movement and those in leadership tend to not look like me, right? They tend to be older, more likely a man, probably white. So I think that it's really important that leadership starts to reflect those of us on the ground in the peace movement, those of us that are most affected by these issues, which I've already mentioned tend to be more women, people of color, queer folk. So I think that it's important that this starts being reflected in the leadership and that people who are most affected are given decision-making power. So yeah, I'd say a challenge that I've faced time and time again as a young woman of color organizer and director of a small peace organization is the same issue that many young women of color, regardless of field, or really young women or young people, regardless of what you're doing, is a questioning of legitimacy. Oh, you're just being naive. Oh, like you don't know what you're talking about, that kind of thing. And I think that something that works in my activism to try to push back against this is to really build trust and build coalitions with people who are going to take me seriously and consider me an equal partner at the table, someone with something to bring, experience, judgment, knowledge even. And I think that it's important to be intentional about the coalitions that you're building and the relationships that you're building and making sure that you're working with people who are already on the ground doing the work or who are not afraid to listen and adapt and won't be offended by you bringing up issues you may have or questions you may have about things, how things are being conducted. So I think that's something I've learned is just be really intentional about who you're working with and what coalitions you're building and who's in the room and who's not. And, you know, on that note, I think that it's important that we respect and listen to the experience of those who have been doing this way before I was alive. But I think we also need to start making sure that we're working with people who are willing to pass the torch or at least share the torch with us and pass wisdom on as opposed to kind of hoarding it with their knowledge and power. So yeah, those are just kind of some of my experiences, and I hope this video is helpful. Thanks for having me. Bye.
So Emily's video sort of sets the tone of the rest of the session. So we've got two questions, and we're going to go through the three speakers for each of the two questions, and then open it up to the audience for any comments or questions that you might have as well. So the first question is, in a time full of concerns around climate change, Brexit and austerity, how do we engage young people with the urgency of issues of peace and disarmament? Nobu, do you want to start and then we'll...
Yeah. In Japan, youngsters have been long time regarded as no interest in politics, anything anymore. But after the disaster, we have found many youngsters started to get involved to help people in the disaster. Hanshin earthquake, East Japan earthquake, Kumamoto earthquake, for the past just a decade or two, Japan has had lots of disasters, including earthquakes and tsunami. And there, what we have seen was active actions of youngsters. So I'm quite sure we can believe in them. What is necessary is our approach, I think. There are so many things we have to deal with. Me Too movement, climate change, lots of discriminations, injustices. So there is no golden straight answer, but I think we need to do something we can do now.
Can I talk based on Nobu's comment? So, like, as a young generation, and then I feel the things Nobu said is quite correct, but then on the other hand, what I've seen was before the incident or disaster actually happened, who cares about the matters? And about this nuclear disarmament thing, it was, for young generation, was a past incident, an historical incident, not related to me anymore. But when my grandfather told me about World War II and US occupation and atrocities and rape and killing people, local people after the end of war, it became my experience. It was not the past or history, but it's actually happening now. So I would say the important thing for mature people have to do is to tell your story to your children or grandchildren, and then the story became their own experience, I think. What do you think?
So yeah, I was leafleting this morning, and I spent quite a lot of time grappling with the concept of what does peace mean to me. If I suddenly go blank, it's because I started thinking about leafleting again and swapped. But for me, I think peace has been defined by an absence of peace. So my dad's family is Algerian, and he grew up during the French occupation. And my grandfather was a campaigner against the French occupation, and for his troubles he was imprisoned by the occupation for 2 years. And during that time, my aunt and my uncle, who were young children, died of easily preventable childhood diseases. And I think that's always stayed and stuck with my family, the impact that there were a family left with the main breadwinner in prison and my grandmother having to struggle alone. And when my grandfather left prison, we had to move. So we had grown up in Mascad, which is a small town towards the Sahara, and we moved to Wahran because it wasn't safe anymore. And I think of the stories that kind of flow through that occupation. I have a good friend in the Green Party who, as a child, she took a bullet to the spine, and she has been disabled her entire life because of the legacy of the French occupation. And I think, touching on what you were just saying, I think these stories are so important. The stories of what peace and an absence of peace are, bring home and make real. Because I think, unfortunately, we live in a time when we are quite insulated from the impact of war, and we have forgotten our stories. And I think there are lots of kind of current issues that really draw that to light. I mean, I think of the Brexit debate and how far away the Northern Irish Troubles seem, and how little awareness and understanding there were from our politicians, from our MPs. I look at Warrington, that voted for Claire Fox to become their MEP despite her track record of what she'd said about Warrington. Our communities have lost our stories. And the irony is that we seem to be in a time when we are more connected than ever. I mean, the internet and Google, they work quite well. The opportunity to find our stories have perhaps never been easier. But we're not looking for them, and we're not finding them. So how do we fix that? And I think it is about bringing back a sense of community and making stories real, and the opportunity to use video, to bring us together, to use social media and put the stories on of people who can make war and conflict and suffering seem real. And I think it's about elevating the lived experiences and the voices of these people impacted, rather than, like the speaker from America was saying, voices that we hear too often, white, male and privileged. It's about elevating those voices who have that real life experience, who can talk about what peace matters to them. So certainly, I think to enliven this movement and to think, I do think there is a massive surge of youth engagement with politics. I think from everything from the climate movement to Corbynism, but right now there is a menu of options to choose with your activism, and I think it can be quite challenging to get people to look at why is your cause the most important. And I think it's about making sure that people can see the connectivity of those causes. And I think the example of the fact that America's militarism means that their police literally have the most awful weapons on the streets is a massive way of engaging communities that hadn't thought about the military, that hadn't thought about the peace. And I think it's about looking for those examples that make life real, that bring it down to everyday life, that can engage and enthuse people about our movement.
I think for me, I always think back to my niece who's 15 and so knowledgeable about the climate strikes, and asked me for the first time ever, we'd both been dragged when we were much younger to protest, but independently, can you take me on this march? None of my friends will go with me, but I want to go. And I think about remembering the fact that young people are so knowledgeable about climate change and the future, and they can deal with the long-term effects that that's going to have. So actually all of these campaigns are really complicated, but they can get that. They can understand complicated issues and they can fight for them. But just about giving them the respect and the time to learn about things. So I think exactly what's been said about stories, and then that becomes their future, their past, and their present. So really discussing with each other. So the next question is, could you tell us about your experience of organising? What challenges have you encountered, and what do you think works? Nobu, would you like to start again?
And so many. We have had so many public meetings, screening with directors talk or producers talk, and this is here. This venue was filled, and we have had involvement from Iraqi students, Indian students, Taiwan students, and so many other backgrounds. And also, just like Japan Society, Anime Society, Manga Society has had lots of film screenings. We have had dozens of events every year since then. The difficulty was, even though we have had sometimes 5 people, sometimes more than 100 people in the events, they do not come back to our next event. Quite often, I alone, or working with just a few number of friends, worked hard for next, but saw lots of new faces, which is good, but yet disappointing. So this year, I started to do something different, reading group, which we can succeed the experience of the hibakusha, the survivors themselves. We can learn through manga, visually. And somehow this started to have new types of audience who started to come back repeatedly, again and again. And of course, I have pasted lots of posters outside of the SOAS. Actually, these are only tiny parts of them. But so far, I have seen only few number of SOAS students there. But still, you can see here now, some of the people who was participating in another meeting in SOAS came to this venue, and thank you very much. And what I can say is there are lots of things we can still do. And actually, I'm not young. Many of you may be older than me, but yet I'm not young. But yet I am a student. So I would say, as long as you have a wish, anyone can do much more. Let me talk something else later.
So in my case, first of all, after coming to the UK, I was quite shocked. Wow, there are so many protests and activist movement. They always organize strike and nobody complain about it. I mean, no, everybody tried to support it for the protesters' right. In Japan, if you join any activist movement or protesters, you'll be seen as crazy or just stupid. So I've been hesitated that talking about Okinawan military-based issue in front of my friends because I'm afraid of being judged by my friends. And then I think organizing this kind of activities requires so much effort before and after organization. Before the organizing this kind of event, in Japanese society, there is a censorship and media limitations. So for example, the 2019 World Press Freedom ranked, according to the World Press Freedom Index, Japan ranked 67 out of 180 countries. This is quite low compared to the developed country, while UK ranked 33rd in the freedom of press. As you can see from here, there is so many censorship in Japan. And for example, one of the Okinawan protester, Yamashiro, has been arrested last year because he put one stone in front of the fence of US bases. That's it. But he is now jailed. So, but even after successfully organizing protesters and make some referendum movement, within organizations, there's always some conflicting interest, like to achieve independence from Japan or just get autonomy from Japan or self-determination. There's always conflicting, so that it's always fail to do effective protesters. So it's quite difficult, but I think it is very important to keep this kind of organizations and try to talk our stories as much as we can.
So I've had the privilege, or perhaps the curse, of being an activist now for about 8 years, and I think over the 8 years, I think I've learned a lot, and I think it's absolutely. I think one of the first things I've learned is it's okay to fail as long as you learn, and it's okay to try new things. And I think particularly it's about looking at if the same things aren't working, how do you look to new things to bring on board people and to engage and to enthuse people. And I think, first of all, it starts with what is meaningful campaigning for people. We live in a time when there are so many big issues that feel almost paralysing. The climate crisis, global war, Trump, all these nightmares that seem paralysing. And a very human response to things that seem so big is either a sense of fatalism or a sense of, actually, well, I'm not going to engage with this, I'm going to parcel that away. So we as campaigners have a responsibility to tell stories that help break down these big issues into things that are real and tangible, that people feel like they can make an impact. So instead of talking about the climate crisis, can we talk about insulating our local community and actually encouraging our local council to make sure people don't live in cold, damp homes? Instead of militarism and that out of control conflicts? Can we talk about what it looks like locally? Can we talk about actually getting a local arms company to not sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, bringing it back to tangible and things that we feel that we can do locally? Because when I think about the campaigns that I feel most proud of that I've had either in my working profession or as a volunteer, some of them are really small. Some of them are things like getting Sainsbury's not to open a second shop on my local high street. But I love my local high street, and it's something that I feel really passionate about defending, and we did it, we won, and we had a good time doing it. And I think that's also another fundamental thing of having fun and working well with the people that you're with. I think nothing is more draining than being on a cause that you care about and spending your time squabbling and arguing and not getting momentum towards what you're trying to achieve. And there's one thing really I think recently that I've done with activism that I think was really inspiring, and I'm really excited to see the continuing results. And I think new people are, you know, your biggest resource. They are that fresh jolt of energy. They've just joined, they're looking to do something. And I think if you're looking to invest time and energy, it's that capacity building that is one of the most important things. So very recently, we invited everyone who had joined this movement within the last year to come to an activist boot camp. And we said, you know, there's the limited amount of places. We'll give you some really great organising training on how to take your involvement and escalate your involvement. Everyone was brand new, and I think about, you know, maybe 75% of people were under 30, which was really interesting. And we trained these people with the skills they need necessarily to organise more of the campaign in their local area. And what's been really exciting is to see the growth from these people who are going back to their local area and building the community and the campaign in their area, and they're putting their skills to test. And also they've built a community between them. So certainly I think, you know, it's quite often that capacity building that falls at the wayside when you're busy organising the next meeting or making social media is updated or the website's up to date. It's that time to engage and build up volunteers, because it is initially very time costly. But I think finding and engaging those new people is one of the most rewarding things you can do, and actually volunteers are the lifeblood of any movement. So if that means postponing the meeting or the next meeting and investing in this project and investing in people, I think that's one of the biggest and most impactful ways to grow any movement.
So now it's open to any audience questions or comments. So does anyone have any? Shoot, so let's do both. So who's on first?
Obviously, with the younger generation, something that's really important is identity politics, and I feel like there's a lot of criticism towards the younger generation for incorporating too much identity politics and making big movements fractious because of that. Because like obviously movements like this, like anti-war movements, have such a long-standing tradition, and the more newer like identity politics the young people focus on can be seen as just bringing in too much squabble into what are life or death issues. So how would you counter those criticisms and like perhaps argue that identity politics is kind of crucial to movements like this? Or would you argue that?
And then over this way.
I guess I just wanted to really support you what you were saying about local activities, because having grown up in a time when we were all very active when we were young, in the 70s and the 60s, and then everybody disappeared, and now people are coming back. But we have a lot of young people who are getting involved in Extinction Rebellion, but also local climate change groups. We have people who are collecting for the food banks. We've had a very solid movement in terms of saving our libraries. And there's just lots of things, I think, that we can bring young people in, but they don't necessarily, and I could be wrong, join organisations like, say, like CND, straightforward, using a lot more social media, etc. But I think you do need to bring it back to a lot of local issues, and then people will join other groups and get involved. So I just wanted to support and see if we could push that a bit more. And I know you're looking at doing things with art and different things there, and I think those sorts of things in your stories are just really great. It's just hard to get people at the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. I was in Japan this summer, and whilst there, there was a presentation of delegates from Okinawa who were really making a big appeal for international solidarity in their struggle against the US building new bases on the island. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that, about the kind of background of the struggle and what's happening there at the moment.
Okay, so we'll take those two questions and comments first and then open it back up. Should we start at that end if you've got any?
In terms of identity politics, in terms of identity politics, just like being Okinawan can be very crucial parts of their lives and ideas, and it can be very important parts of their lives, and that's the same for the campaignings, I believe. But yet, sometimes being Japanese could mean something else. Sometimes, not just because we are Japanese, it doesn't mean we are against nuclear weapons. Japanese government itself has opposed to neglected to support banning of nuclear weapons, UN treaty, etc. So I think we need to understand the both sides of that identity politics.
Like, to add it to the Nobu-san's point about identity politics, I think identity politics could be used as a good tool to collaborate people together, or also could be manipulated by the authorities. Like in the case of Okinawa, if I say I'm from Okinawa and I have Okinawan identity, some right-wing people attack me saying that, oh, you're a traitor, or oh, you are maybe spy from China or something like that. So it's quite difficult to collaborate with identity politics, and it's very complicated matter, I think.
So, I grew up gay and Muslim, and I think I have the scars of that on my back, some figurative, some more physical, and that's one of the big things that brought me to activism. So when I was 18, I went to university to build my life in the way that I wanted it to be. Being active about Pride and being an LGBT campaigner, and kind of linking that to the unfairness or the lack of rights sometimes that I saw growing up were what made me become an activist. And I think in an era where people are more able to have those conversations and talk about the ways the society is organised and the lack of opportunities sometimes that who you are or how you live creates, I think has been a massive route for a lot of people into their activism and a lot of people to engage with. And I think it's about how do you use that conversation to channel those injustices, to draw the bigger picture as well, to say that we are all oppressed by this current situation, and actually talk about how these movements for change benefit everyone. As a man, there are sides to the patriarchy that are not good or conducive to my life, and how do we talk to all men about the poisonous nature of patriarchy and the opportunity that feminism provides? How do we talk about greater freedom about sexuality being a benefit for everyone, not just gay people, but heterosexual people too? It's about talking about how these movement and causes are about freedom for everyone, not at anyone's expense. And if we're all willing to be part of a society that is open and welcoming and encouraging, then we can all be part of that better life. So I think there is a next step to identity politics, and it is about talking about how we can all benefit. And I think it's also about better talking about class and embedding kind of class analysis in that issue. I know certainly growing up on free school meals in a family that was on benefits, that was a huge curtail in our opportunity that still sticks with us. And I think we need to embed those discussions and those impacts better in identity politics. And touching on movements, yeah, absolutely. I think bringing it local, bringing it small. I think I think these are the conversations that we're all having now, because I wasn't there, but I get the impression that these massive explosions of movements in the 60s and 70s were so big and so exciting, but then some of those battles were lost and the next steps were so hard to find. And I think there's just some fundamental organising principles we can embed into everything. So, having a campaign that draws people in, but making sure that everyone who comes leaves with an action that they can take back to them, that they're motivated and excited about. If that's someone making a poster for us, if that's someone doing some knitting, if that's someone recording a video, having a menu or a list of things, so whatever anyone's interested in, they can contribute towards the campaign. Obviously, you've got some more important asks, and it might be that someone might get to do some nice knitting, but they might deliver 100 leaflets for you as well. But understanding that hierarchy of what's going to make an impact for your campaign.
At my work, we have, just because of it being an SU, so staff tend to be from sort of campaignery backgrounds and stuff. And one of the ladies, she led her secondary school to do a walkout to do with the Iraq War. And I watched a film a few years ago that showed, the thousands of school children, especially in Scotland, that walked out, and it was absolutely fantastic. But then they sort of disappeared, and they're now, full-grown adults in jobs that aren't really campaigning as much. So I think we also need to think about how do we maintain momentum on generations, and how do we make sure that the children that are currently engaging with the youth strikes, what happens when they graduate, and what happens when they finish university, or what happens when they reach university and they get swept up in the normal university lifestyle. How do we make sure that there's, especially on these big issues that will be really long to be able to win, how do we keep them motivated and supporting them? Because sort of the mental health effect of climate change and the anxiety that can bring, and then if you look at nuclear weapons, that's also a very scary thing. So how do we sort of keep the momentum, but also make sure that people are okay, which I don't know how, but I think it's something that we always need to be considerate of, and especially when you're planning campaigns, having those breathing spaces for people to recover, or to and also how to make sure that people feel comfortable coming back in after they've been quiet for a while, which can also be a really scary thing if you've had a really busy time of things and you want to get back involved, but it's been a few months, so you will have missed everything. How to make it as welcoming at every single event is really, really important. And it can just be as much as on the leaflet saying, everyone's welcome, there's going to be tea and biscuits, but that can actually make a massive difference to whether people attend or not. Does anyone else have any questions or comments to add? Yeah. So
I just want to address identity politics. And for the lady, I know all about Okinawa, and the whole population rose to push out the bases. It wasn't covered by the media. Tens of thousands of people, after a rampaging crime wave of rape, murder, robbery by US servicemen. But we'll put that to one side. Identity politics or culture wars, this is a very dangerous trap that we could fall into. And this, I think, what lost the election for the most progressive manifesto that I've seen from the Labour Party since Attlee. Also, no platforming. We've seen no platforming in universities. If you no platform these people, you can't take the fight to the enemy. You can't discredit the fascists, the racists, the homophobes, the anti-Semites if they're boxed away and martyred in the right-wing media. You've got to take the fight to the enemy. Trust me, I've been there years ago. And they're back. They're back with a vengeance. And they've got street cred. We can't allow this. You've got to take... And it's the power of arguments and having your facts and being able to argue these people down. It's very, very important. It's so important. you're just giving fuel to the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and unbelievably the Guardian. What kind of paper is that now? It's just a neoliberal mouthpiece for MI6 and GCHQ and the NSA. So we've got to get the argument, the facts, and argue these people out of town. That's all I've got to say.
Mine was a question. So I just wanted to know, I'm now thrilled to bits that you're here. I'm absolutely delighted to see you. And I wanted to know whether you, as individuals, as part of CND, had anything to say to the old people like me. Are we not treating you right? Are we not welcoming you? Because I thought we were, but I may be wrong. I'd like an honest answer to that.
Was your hand up?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yes it was. I was just going to make a contribution. The problem
Could you
is
speak a
that.
little louder, please?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean, the problem is that we work locally, but a lot of the issues we have to deal with are very global ones. And I mean, there's always a balance here. If I could say that, the chap who discovered global warming, Charles Keeling from the Scripps Institute, he invented it, discovered it was happening. On the one hand, he managed to get it to ultimately we had intergovernmental conferences on global warming. In his spare time, he was campaigning to keep Walmart out of his town in California to protect the local shops. So there's always a two sides to it all, but there's a danger that we lose. If we focus too much on the local events, we're not discussing the big picture. That there are dozens of small groups campaigning on environmentalism, but actually there's the baseline is that there's the Government Committee on Climate Change, which was set up by the Labour government, which has a plan for decarbonising Britain. It's very detailed. Nobody reads it. Why not? Well, it's difficult, and therefore, as part of our local campaigning, we need to have people to discuss what the national plan is and criticise it and argue for change, not just ignore it. And exactly the same goes as we try and do within CND, that we campaign locally, but actually we want a change of national defence strategy. We're focusing on the big picture. So it does have to work both ways, and occasionally we say, we concentrate on local things. Well, it isn't quite enough. We mobilise people locally where we can, but we have to keep an eye on the big things as well.
Thank you. So if we go
It's
through
like,
the
should go the other way, yeah. So, yeah, I think a few things. I think absolutely you have to link the local back to the cause that drew people in the first place. People start with the big things, don't they? They start with the climate crisis. They start with the Iraq War, and you have to keep linking back and talking and bringing it home what the impact and of sometimes small things are towards the bigger cause, and it's an ongoing conversation. But I have to say, I'm a time poor person. I probably say yes to too many things. This is my third talk in 24 hours. But my preference for the time I have is to do. It's not to talk. And I want to spend the time I have outside my job feeling like I'm making a difference. And so that really making sure that there are clear and tangible things that people feel that they can spend an hour or two, be that in a home or in a workshop in a group, where they're meaningfully contributing towards a cause, I think is a really important thing. And I definitely think, particularly, building up volunteers and getting people engaged with the movement, it's about having that clear idea of what are those things that start small and get people to escalate their involvement. My massive involvement in the Green Party started from me putting my hand up in a meeting saying, I could help you write that survey. And it went downhill from there. I think on no platforming and identity issues, I read a really, really interesting study recently about Belgium. So Belgium, you have Flanders and you have Walloon, and politically it's a really interesting split, because in Flanders you have two far-right parties that are surging in a really kind of worrying way, FVD and Vlaams Belang. And in Walloon, you don't have a far-right movement at all. The far-right don't have any seats or any representation. And they looked at why that was the case. One of the biggest cases was the media. In Flanders, when Vlaams Belang first started, they were given a lot of coverage. Their views were seen as legitimate concerns, and they were treated as equally and as serious as the mainstream. In Flanders, these views, these people, were never given a platform. They weren't treated as serious ideas. They weren't treated as some things that were merit and worthy to be covered on the media. And so they've never grown. And I think there is, and there has to be, a line about what is worth debating and what isn't. Because by sitting on a platform with certain things, you legitimise that view. If I tomorrow was invited to a panel that was going to debate whether or not gay people should face the death penalty, I would decline, because that's not a debate worth having. And I think that evidences that there is a line somewhere, and at one point we have to say, that's not a debate or an issue worth discussing. I think the problem we have in the UK now is that, unfortunately, the far right have captured a lot of these platforms, and they are mainstream, and we are stuck in this frame of debating whether or not refugees deserve kindness or humanity, or whether or not the poor should have enough to eat. We're stuck on these really toxic frames. And I think it's about how do we lift up the debate and change the debate. Because I think I went to a really interesting conference this week on framing, and I think each and every one of us in this era of polarisation and in this era of cultural wars, it's very human to believe very contradictory things. We can believe both that homeless people are to blame for their problem, but we can also believe that societal problems are the cause of and the root, and they need challenging. And I think our opportunity and our choice as storytellers and campaigners is how do we bring out the good thoughts that we all have inside of us instead of the toxic ones. And I think sometimes that's about rejecting the framing that is the main discourse and is the dominant discourse. And it's about saying instead and changing that narrative. And I really, Frameworks Institute do some fantastic work about, and they publish a lot of reports publicly about how to change the debate and how to avoid getting stuck on the Daily Mail headline. And I think that's really important. And just going back to your point, definitely there are lots of times that people have been very lovely, and I've been involved in Green Party politics for a very long time, and there've been times that I've been to meetings where there's 2 people, and that you've put a lot of work into it, and suddenly you've got another meeting where 40 people have come. I think it's about just being really clear and having. I love a checklist either mentally or written down about what is every good step that is going to mean that you are most likely to get people back. And it's things like remembering to thank people, it's like things like reminding everyone who's RSVP to your event, calling up the day before, are they coming, making sure that someone feels an ownership and a responsibility to greet and welcome people, that someone feels a responsibility to make sure that everyone's following up with an action that they can take afterwards, that everyone who isn't already running your organisation is running their strengths. So if someone is very good at logistics but they're not a people person, or they're not in charge of the people. And I've seen lots of times of mismatches of kind of actually, I'm not the logistics person. If you want the leaflets or whatever things on time, I'm not trusted on any of that. I'm very good at being chatty and welcoming, so make sure I'm in charge of that. So I think it's just about making sure that, and I think if you look back, whenever I look back at anything I've organised that hasn't gone quite well, I can look back and I go, okay, right, well, we forgot to thank people, or we forgot to remind people, or actually the follow-up activity that we had here wasn't quite right. And it's just about having that constant iterative process of learning and finding out what's right, and having a good time doing it, and including things like social events. But I think especially social events with action, because if I just wanted a social event, I'll go to go with my friends. I'm here to do something as well as have a nice time.
Nothing to add it.
I'm sorry.
Wonderful question. But if I say something from my perspective, also, yeah, I missed to answer your question, Hannah. So, like, yeah, local issue and global issues often overlapping each other. Like, for example, in the case of Okinawa, it's US military bases and sexism and racism. It's happening everywhere, right? So, once you realize the matter is related to you and you will get interested in it, and then you will try to tackle with it, like, oh, I'll talk later.
Social campaigning is a kind of a life. It grows, it shrinks, and sometimes, if the reason disappears, it dies. In that sense, it's a reflection of the reality. Anti-nuclear campaign started only after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it grew every time people saw crisis in Aldermaston, the Bikini Atoll, new type of nuclear test, Cuban crisis, and every time America announced to use, they dare to use nuclear weapons in other countries. So I think it is really important to survive as campaigning body as long as there is a reason there. And I'm quite sure that anti-nuclear campaigning and peace campaigning will not disappear. But at the same time, I want to say two sides of importance. It is important to be vocal, yes. But at the same time, I started to think that it is really important to listen to the youngsters. And one of the successful causes of the reading group is, in this event, participants have lots of times what they think, what they feel, what they knew or didn't know. So I am trying to speak when other people do not. But other than that, I try to listen to other people say. And this might be something we can try, that both to be vocal and to listen. Yes.
I think one of the things that I found with my friend, I've always been the political friend of any of my friendship groups, and my friends have always cared about the issues when I've explained it to them, but it's always seemed quite big and quite intimidating, them going on things on their own. So if there's a protest march, they'll come with me if it's not raining. But a meeting, it's, no, don't worry, it will be fine, we can go out for a drink afterwards. So I think that it's really important to remember that quite a lot of these campaigns that we're involved in have been for so long, which means that actually there's an awful lot of knowledge that people might have grown up with or been involved in the creation of that knowledge. And so from someone wanting to start, where do you start? Where do you go to find out what the actual issue is, what the actual point of this particular meeting is going to be? So about remembering the sort of, to every now and again, like the London CND, the new member meeting, it just having really low level, friendly, come and you'll learn loads of stuff, but it won't be intense. And if you forget about it, there'll be another one soon that you can learn it all over again. And another thing that I've found in meetings is, which I think is a barrier for people coming again, is the jargon that's used. And there's quite a lot of, you'll be talking about this policy and this thing that was signed 20 years ago, and there'll be no sort of context given, which if you're within the whatever the campaign is, that's completely fine because you all know about it. But from an outsider sitting in an hour-long meeting, say, where there's about 10 different references that you have no idea what they're about. It can be sort of really scary to put your hand up and ask, but then also it means that you come away really confused. So I think just for everyone, whatever the organisation is, if you've been in it for a while, just every now and again think, would I know what I was talking about if I was new? And quite often it will be really quick to just explain, but that will make such a difference, and then it will mean people will come along more. So just remembering. And with my job with the SU, we're sat in so many university meetings, and I just have, the first term, I had no idea what was going on with half of it, because the policies I had no idea about, and then I'd have to go and ask my CEO afterwards, which meant I couldn't actually engage in the meetings themselves. So that's always something that I think, especially for new members and younger people who are just starting out, giving ways for them to feel more confident is really important. So we haven't got very long left, so is there any other questions or comments anyone wants to add? Yeah.
I don't know, I wanted to fit into the debate that's already is happening. But one thing I notice is that, you know, on a lot of the platforms, you'll hear a lot of kind of like British foreign policy be talked about, for instance. And the national interest is something that's often mentioned, and it's a lot of spokespeople on like Foreign Affairs Committee or whatever. They'll say, and it is our national interest for the people, and it's a lot of debate about they're doing their best for us as British UK citizens in foreign policy, and they talk about what their hopes, aspirations are as a foreign service abroad, but they don't really explain what is the vision, what is the end goal, what are those priorities. I mean, you can look in policies, and like David Cameron spoke openly about prosperity being an aim of foreign policy, for example. So militarism towards prosperity, which to me sounds pretty grotesque. I think there could be more work done looking at that side, because it's never challenged, I find. It's just a given, you know, you're not patriotic, you don't get on board what's the national interest, our interest is. And, you know, some countries do it better, they talk about peace in their agenda, we talk about prosperity at the barrel of a gun.
Has anyone got any comments in response to that?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've very much grown up, and throughout British colonial history, it's been about the interest of this sovereign nation, this sovereign land, and that we have the most in common with the people on these islands. And I think what's interesting is we live in a time when we can reduce that social distance between us and the citizens of the world, and actually make it really concrete that I, as a 31-year-old man in London, have potentially lots of things in common with someone growing up in the Philippines or growing up in Australia or growing up in whatever country. But social media and again storytelling is a great way to bridge and reduce that social distance, because I think we look at, again, liberation movements, and one of the biggest changes in social attitudes we've last seen in the last 30 and 40 years is attitudes towards gay people. Pre-Harvey Milk, if you were asking people, would you happily be the neighbour of a gay person, the response rate was really low and really poor, and we've seen the biggest kind of social change in 40, 50 years. How was that done? It was done by people coming out and humanising and becoming real people. And I think for the peace movement, it's how do you make those people being crushed under the foot by imperialistic politics real? And how do you make those stories feel close and active and vibrant? And you think of the opportunities and the times when we have broken through, it is through personal stories, whether that's a dead young boy on the side of a beach, or it's the young child in Syria trying to survive bombing. Foreign policy has been made real by real people and by sharing their voices. And so for us to counter that narrative of, charity starts at home, I think it's about making the case that humanity starts across the world.
Brilliant. So we are bang on time. So thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much for the panel. And yeah, thank you.